Boomers podcast, and I'm your host, Jennifer Warren, back behind the black and blue mic and ready to get into it. It seems like about 1 billion years ago, but back in 2016, the last election for president, the Republican Party declared that internet pornography was a public health crisis. Their words, not mine. And they voted to insert that phrase into the official party platform. The delegates from the Republican Party ratified that document at the very same convention that would nominate Donald Trump, a man who had an affair with an actual porn star and paid her $130,000 to be quiet about it. Yeah, Donald Trump. Yeah, a public health crisis in the making, according to his own party. Interesting, isn't it? Yeah, and he's the guy they decided would be an excellent example of how serious they were about internet porn. That contradiction and moral flexibility pretty much defines today's Republican Party, or should I say, Trumpian Party. Vice President Mike Pence famously made a show out of walking out of an NFL game just last year because he said he would, quote, not dignify any event that disrespects our soldiers, our flag, or our national anthem. Well, where was the concern for the dignity of our soldiers when Trump declared that the now late Senator John McCain was, quote, not a war hero because he was captured, unquote. You remember? He said, I like people who weren't captured. He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people who weren't captured. Where is the concern for our servicemen, servicewomen, and families when the Trump-Pence administration has just eliminated financial protections for military members who were targeted by predatory lenders? For the past 30 years or so, the Republican Party has cast itself as the party of morality and family values. But it's taken no issue with its own leader being credibly accused of sexual assault by not one, but dozens of women. They can't seem to find any words when it comes to Trump's adulterous past, which could well include fathering illegitimate children. The reality is that today there is no ideological consistency or moral compass that guides the Republican Party. No, Trump is the only compass they need, and he's the only compass they want. In the absence of a principled philosophy is the dangerous mentality that the state is right and everybody else is wrong. That's why we get phrases like fake news and Trump saying that the press, which is the only industry specifically protected by the Constitution, is the enemy of the people. Even more upsetting is the trend that anybody who has the audacity to exercise their constitutionally protected right of free speech to question the government is also labeled an enemy of the people. That includes yours truly. This lurch towards authoritarian extremism is probably about the most destructive thing that's ever happened to our country. It's a disease that has contaminated the entire Republican Party and threatens to destroy the very fabric of our nation. Right now, American citizens are having their rights upended and their freedoms suspended. The First Amendment is under siege. The national security administrations we rely on to protect us are being compromised and dismantled. Criminals are being hailed as heroes. You know, in 1865, lawmakers amended the Constitution to outlaw slavery, except as a punishment for crimes where the person has been convicted. At that point, Southern states began to lease out convicts to private firms, essentially perpetuating slavery. Many Southern states continued their convict lease programs into the early 20th century. In 1929, Congress restricted the sale of prison-made goods across state lines, though lawmakers later created an exception, allowing firms to use prison labor if the prisoners receive the prevailing wage for similar work in their areas. Only a tiny number of prisoners participate in the so-called Prison Industry Enhancement Certification Program, but prison labor reform advocates have pointed to it as a possible template for increasing prisoner wages. You see, in addition to making prisoners do prison upkeep, the federal government runs about 60 factories that employed nearly 17,000 prisoners in 2017. And that's according to the latest annual report from Federal Prison Industries. That's the government-owned corporation that employs federal prisoners, also known as legal slaves. Those incarcerated in federal prisons doing custodial work can earn between 12 and 40 cents an hour. Ooh! All while convicts working in a federal prison industry factory can get as much as $1.15. Wow! Boy, you want to rush into that job, huh? You wonder how it is that the government gets away with paying people less than people earn in third world countries like Haiti. Well, the federal pay rates haven't increased in at least 20 years, even while the federal minimum wage has risen from $4.25 to $7.25. Courts have held that prisoners are not entitled to the same protections as free workers under the Fair Labor Standards Act. But then again, there's an old saying, the biggest thieves never do time. Wall Street is celebrating the largest bull market in history. Not everybody agrees with that, of course, but the critiques are highly technical, and nobody would question that stocks have done very well since March of 2009. You know, under the Obama administration. Still, this milestone that benefits the top 1% diverges from the well-being of most people who work for wages, and that's regardless of whether they're in prison or not. A total of 21 states are either governed by the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour or set their state law to that level. This pay reached its maximum purchasing power about 50 years ago, and currently it badly lags as to an amount that's enough to allow people to keep a roof over their head. With no connection between a higher minimum wage and state economic performance, for example, in Washington State, where I live, $11.50 an hour is basically what the bare minimum you need in some areas. Even though we have it at $15 an hour here in Seattle. In Mississippi, though, the minimum wage is set to $7.25, and the only thing holding back an increase is right-wing ideology. The 2018 Pentagon budget, which they say is more important than the well-being of the citizens of the United States, already totals $647 billion, 4 times what China, which is second in global military spending, shells out, and more than the next 12 countries combined, 7 of whom are American allies. Now, that figure doesn't include the additional billions spent on construction of nuclear weapons by the Department of Energy. But that's a neat little trick that Republicans like to play to deny the outrageous defense budget. You point out the total figure, and they point to the Pentagon budget as if that represents the whole of it. It doesn't. The actual figure currently hovers around $1 trillion a year. And for good measure, Donald Trump added an additional $200 billion to projected defense expenditures through 2019. For millions of Americans, however, the greatest threat to their day-to-day security isn't terrorism or North Korea. It's not Iran, Russia, or China. It's internal, and it's economic. That's particularly true for the nearly 13% of Americans, so a little over 43 million of us, that are classified as poor by the government's own criteria, with an income below around $12,000 for a one-person household, or the princely sum of just over $42,000 for a family of 8. Savings aren't much help either. A third of Americans have no savings at all, and another third have less than $1,000 in the bank. Little wonder that so many families are struggling to cover the cost of food, which is about 36 million families. In 2007, it rose to 48 million people. States can make a higher minimum wage, and 29 have, but 21 have not, leaving many low-wage workers struggling to cover the cost of 2 essential expenses: health care and housing. Even when it comes to jobs that offer health insurance, employers have been shifting ever more of it onto the cost of their workers through higher deductibles and out-of-pocket expenses, as well as requiring them to cover more of the premiums. The percentage of workers who paid at least 10% of their work earnings to cover such costs, not counting premiums, doubled between 2003 and 2014. Now that helps explain why, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, only 11% of workers in the bottom 10% of wage earners even enrolled in workplace health care in 2016. That's compared to 72% of the top 10%. That's the millionaires and billionaires. As a restaurant server who makes $2 an hour before tips and whose husband earns $9 an hour, Walmart put it, it's either put food in the house or buy insurance. The Affordable Care Act, or the ACA, which is also known as Obamacare, yes, they are the same thing, provided subsidies to help people with low income cover the cost of insurance premiums. But workers with employer-supplied health care, no matter how low their wages are, weren't covered by it. Now, of course, President Trump and Republicans, along with their stacked Supreme Court, in which right-wing justices are going to be even more influential, are intent on killing the Affordable Care Act. It's housing, though, that makes the biggest bite in paychecks of low-wage workers. The majority of